The day had begun without purpose, as many of mine do, a faint mist trailing off the river like a thought that refused to settle. I'd walked from the station without reason or destination, though perhaps one always has a reason even when pretending not to. The air carried that gentle, metallic scent particular to early autumn in Oxford damp stone, rotting leaves, and something older, something one could almost call regret. By the time I reached the Cherwell, the punts were tethered in a neat, despondent line. Across the water, beyond the reeds, a woman sat on a low wooden stool with her back to me. She wore a wide hat that trembled slightly in the wind, and from where I stood she seemed to be sketching the boats not with enthusiasm, but with that air of distraction that belongs to those who draw more to think than to see. I might have walked on, had she not turned her head a fraction, as though expecting someone. Then, just as quickly, she bent back to her sketchbook, her posture composed, deliberate. I've often thought that Oxford is a city most alive in its silences. The cries of rowers echoing from the distance, the soft thud of bicycle tires against wet cobbles, the murmur of someone closing a college gate. One hears them and imagines the inner life that accompanies each sound. It was in such silence that I found myself watching the woman longer than politeness allowed, though she never once looked my way again. It was nearly noon when I drifted toward the Magdalen boathouse and took refuge in a pub nearby, the sort that never changes its wallpaper or its clientele. The landlord nodded toward me with the vague familiarity reserved for solitary drinkers. I ordered a pint, sat in the corner, and listened without appearing to. Two men at the bar were talking, not loudly, but with the kind of guarded urgency that piques one's interest. Something about a photograph. A missing one. One said it had gone again, as though it had developed the habit of disappearing. The other only muttered that it was better lost than found. Now, there are phrases that cling to one like burrs, and that one did. Better lost than found. It struck me as curiously moral, almost biblical in its simplicity. I turned it over in my mind as I drank, the way one turns a crossword clue when the answer refuses to fit. Perhaps it was the drink, or perhaps it was the hour, but I left the pub with the distinct sense that something had begun, though I couldn't have said what. The streets were grayer when I reached my flat. I remember the faint sound of a piano from the building opposite, one of those hesitant student attempts at Schubert. The melody faltered midway, recovered, and broke again. It seemed an appropriate accompaniment to the day. I poured myself a whiskey, half-heartedly opened the Times, and saw the usual parade of small tragedies. An obituary, an arrest, a notice about the next college concert. None of it held my attention until the telephone rang. Stranger's voice came through the receiver, dry as ever, with the faint echo of disapproval that years of knowing me had failed to soften. "There's a death at St. Cuthbert's," he said. "A lecturer. You might as well have a look, though there's no real need. Looks like suicide." I could hear the unspoken suggestion that perhaps I should leave it to others, to those who didn't make a habit of doubting such conclusions. But something in me stirred a small, reluctant curiosity. St. Cuthbert's, of all places. The college with the locked gardens and the reputation for discretion. I had once known someone there. The name came before I wished it to Eleanor Blake. A faint pulse of memory. Half pleasure, half unease. I told Strange I'd go, though without much enthusiasm. The evening light had begun to fade by the time I left again, the streets glistening after a brief rain. As I crossed Magdalen Bridge, I looked once more toward the river. The woman was gone, but her absence felt oddly deliberate, as if she had packed it carefully away. I paused there, watching the water take on the first faint glimmer of the street lamps, and it occurred to me absurdly, yet not without reason, that her sketchbook might have contained something worth more than its paper. Later, when I stood in that quiet college room and saw Eleanor Blake's body slumped beside the desk, her hand still resting near the typewriter, I remembered the woman by the river. not for any rational cause, but because the light had the same grey patience, and because both moments shared that peculiar stillness that falls when something unseen has already shifted the world a fraction to one side. It is always the quiet rooms that unsettle me most, the sort where nothing appears broken, and yet the air insists that something has been disturbed beyond repair. Eleanor Blake's rooms at St. Cuthbert's were like that still, ordered yet faintly wrong, as though the walls themselves had witnessed a scene they could not quite forget. Lewis stood awkwardly by the door, his shoes damp from the quadrangle. He had drawn back the curtains earlier, but the light coming through was thin, watery, the sort of light that turns everything into the color of doubt. I remember the faint hum of a typewriter ribbon unspooling itself and the sharp, clean smell of old wine. The bottle stood on the table, half empty, though the glass beside it remained untouched. She had died in the chair nearest the fire, fully dressed, one hand resting against her neck. There was no drama about it, no performance. I have seen many who wished to be found, and she was not one of them. She seemed instead to have fallen into death as one might fall into silence. Lewis handed me the letter first, half-typed, still in the carriage. The words ended abruptly midway through a sentence. You must understand that I never, and then nothing. I read it twice, perhaps 3 times. Each time it felt less like a suicide note and more like an argument paused by interruption. There was an envelope beside it, addressed but not sealed. The name on it was familiar, Sir Julian Rake, he of the college endowments and glossy dinners, the sort of man who calls everyone old chap and remembers nothing about them. I asked Lewis to check the pigeonholes in the porter's lodge with no outgoing mail from her since Monday, 3 days ago, a curious delay for a woman so habitually punctual. On the mantelpiece, a photograph. 7 men in rowing uniforms, standing stiffly by the water. A younger Sir Julian among them, all arrogance and promise. The frame bore a faint outline where another photograph had once hung larger, perhaps recently removed. I ran a finger along the edge. The dust told its own story. Something had been lifted away only hours before. Lewis pointed to a stack of papers tied with a ribbon, the neatness of which jarred with the rest of the scene. Research notes, she said, for a forthcoming lecture. Yet within them I found a library request slip from the Bodleian, dated the same day she died, Cuthbert College Annual Report, 1975. An unremarkable title, unless one knew that year, marked the drowning of a scholar named Peter Vale. I vaguely remembered the incident of a promising young historian found by the river after a night of drinking, a verdict of misadventure, Oxford's favourite euphemism. I looked around once more, nothing out of place, and yet everything misaligned. Her typewriter ribbon had not been changed for weeks, and an academic who lived by words would never let it run so faint. Her wastebasket empty, though every desk drawer brimmed with drafts. And on the arm of her chair, a thin smear of ink, not from her pen, from another. Lewis said softly that perhaps she had been drinking alone, overcome by her troubles. I heard myself reply that one rarely pours for oneself with such care. There were 2 glasses on the table, not one. The second had been wiped clean, clumsily. I bent down, adjusting the lamp. The light caught the keys of the typewriter, and there, almost invisible, a faint indentation in the ribbon below the last words. I rolled it back. The letter continued for half a line and never forgave you for what happened that night. Then it ended for good. Outside, the chapel bell began to toll, and for a moment it sounded like a confession left unfinished. I told Lewis to seal the room until morning. He nodded, relieved to escape its stillness. I stayed a little longer. There is something about the unsent letter that unsettles even the most seasoned of men. It exists in that narrow space between intention and silence. And as I left the college, the rain began to fall again in slow, deliberate drops. I thought of how many things in this city are never quite sent, never quite said, and never entirely forgotten. There is a certain smell particular to college porters' lodges: pipe smoke, damp coats, and the faint musk of ink pads long since dry. St. Cuthbert's was no exception. The air inside felt older than the building itself, as though generations of secrets had soaked into the wood. Mr. Haynes, the porter, sat behind his desk like a man guarding not the college, but time itself. He looked up when I entered, his gaze steady, the kind of man who measures words before spending them. Lewis hovered near the notice board, pretending to read the list of lost umbrellas. I asked when he had last seen Dr. Blake alive. Haynes folded his hands and thought for a long time before answering. "Monday evening," he said finally. She came down about 9:30. There was a visitor, a gentleman. He told it as though describing a scene from a half-remembered dream. A man in a raincoat, tall, hat pulled low. He hadn't caught the face, only the voice. They stood just inside the archway, out of the rain, talking quietly. The man had quoted something in a line of poetry, perhaps about Time's crooked hand. Haynes hadn't thought much of it then, but as he repeated it, I felt the faint stirring of recognition. Time's crooked hand. Not a common phrase. Larkin, I thought, though imperfectly recalled. The line was wrong, the kind of misquotation that reveals more than it conceals. I asked Haynes if he had written the name in the visitor's book. He looked embarrassed. "No, sir. The man said he was expecting." "And Dr. Blake confirmed it." Lewis shifted his weight. "You mean he came in without a record?" Haynes nodded, the gesture small, defensive. I could see the guilt working in him, the old porter's dread of having failed the invisible standards of his post. I told him not to worry, though the omission gnawed at me. In Oxford, every name recorded is a name remembered, every name omitted, forgotten by design. On the wall behind him hung a small brass clock, its pendulum ticking unevenly, like an old man's breath. I watched it while Haynes spoke of the night. The rain had been heavy. He'd thought the man left around 10, but couldn't be sure. Said he'd heard footsteps crossing the quad. Or perhaps it had been the wind. That was the thing about this place. Even the weather conspired in confusion. Lewis asked whether Dr. Blake seemed upset. Haynes hesitated. "Not upset, sir. Tired, perhaps." She was polite, but distant. "She'd been carrying a letter," he said. "Folded, but not sealed." He remembered because she kept adjusting it in her hand, as though debating whether to send it. He thought she put it in her pocket before she went back upstairs. A small thing, that gesture. But I had seen the letter, half-typed, unsent. So she had taken it with her to the meeting, and afterward returned to her room without posting it. A decision made, or unmade, between 1 hour and the next. Before leaving, I asked Haynes whether he might describe the man's voice. He frowned, thinking. "Educated," he said, "but not quite academic. Northern, maybe, or something that wanted to hide a northern trace." When he spoke, he seemed careful, like someone used to being listened to. I thanked him, though he seemed unconvinced he had helped. As we stepped back into the quadrangle, the evening light was already sinking, the stones glistening from a recent shower. Lewis remarked that it didn't sound much like a suicide after all. I said nothing. Somewhere behind us, the chapel bell began its low rehearsal for evensong, and as we walked toward the gate, I recalled the phrase again, "Time's crooked hand," and wondered why men so often quote poetry when they lie. There was something about that detail that would not let go of me. A man misquoting a poet, a porter who forgot to write a name, and a letter that never found its way to the post. 3 absences, perfectly aligned, like notes missing from a tune one can almost remember. There is a certain stillness peculiar to college offices after dusk, the kind of stillness that carries authority. Dr. Ashcroft's study was of that order. A tall window overlooking the quadrangle, 2 shelves of unreadable theology, and a desk too polished to be innocent. The dean himself was seated behind it, immaculately dressed, his expression that curious blend of piety and calculation one finds in men who have learned to hide behind gentility. He greeted me with the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed but polite enough to disguise it. Lewis and I sat opposite him, though he did most of the talking. Eleanor Blake had been, in his words, a fine scholar but increasingly unstable. She had suffered disappointments, professional and, he implied, personal. There had been tension in recent months over a research grant withdrawn at the last minute. When I asked who had withdrawn it, he said quietly that it was Sir Julian Rake. He used the name as though it carried an inevitability, and, in a sense, it did. Sir Julian's patronage of the college had been both a blessing and a burden. I had met him once, years earlier, a man of taste, wealth, and the sort of charm that flourishes best among the half-admiring. The dean poured himself a small glass of sherry and held it without drinking. He said Eleanor had taken the rejection badly. She believed the decision had been personal, though the college had tried to assure her otherwise. I asked whether he believed that. His pause was brief but long enough to betray him. He spoke then of concern for her mental health, of late-night calls to colleagues, erratic behavior. The phrases had the tidy rhythm of something rehearsed. Lewis noted that Eleanor had written a letter to Sir Julian. Dean's eyes flicked towards him, not a full movement, merely a glance, as though a nerve had twitched. I said we had found the letter unfinished, that she had written of forgiveness and of a night she could not forget. His face, for a moment, lost its composure. Then he smiled, thinly, and said that Eleanor was prone to melodrama. There are silences that weigh more than confessions. In his, I heard a faint clock ticking from the mantel, its pendulum lagging half a second behind time. A small imperfection, easily ignored, yet I found myself staring at it while he spoke, my mind not on the words, but on the rhythm of that tiny hesitation before the swing completed. When men lie, they often have their own pendulum, a pause where truth ought to land. I asked whether he had known her well. His answer came too easily professionally, of course. She was a brilliant mind, though too sensitive for the politics of academia. Then, after a pause so careful it might have been measured, he added that she had once been close to Sir Julian, closer than propriety allowed. Lewis shifted uneasily. The dean noticed, and his voice softened as if offering absolution. "Oxford," he said, "has a long history of misplaced affections. We all pay for them in our own ways." When we left, the porter outside was locking the chapel. The air smelled faintly of rain. I looked back at the window of Ashcroft's study. The light still burned there, yellow against the dark stone. Men who lie rarely do so for strangers. They lie for ghosts, for those who once knew their unguarded selves. In the porter's lodge, I asked Haynes for the college's photographic archive. He brought out a folder labeled 1970-1980, the kind of dusty relic no one looks at unless they are searching for the past. Inside were photographs of rowing teams, dinners, ceremonies. And there, among them, the same image I'd seen in Eleanor's room, the St. Cuthbert's rowing team of 1975. 7 men by the water, with Sir Julian smiling too widely. Only here, something had been altered. The space beside him was neatly trimmed away, the cut deliberate, clean. Whoever had done it had taken care to preserve the balance of the composition. I asked Haynes who kept the originals. "The dean, sir. Always the dean." Lewis glanced at me. "Another small thing, but small things are where truth hides." I closed the folder, the faint smell of old paper rising like dust, disturbed by memory. In Oxford, the past never stays buried. It lingers, perfectly catalogued, until someone asks the wrong question. That night, back in my flat, I poured a whiskey and stared at my crossword. The clue read, "A sin concealed by faith." 5. I wrote the answer without hesitation, then crossed it out. It seemed too obvious. There are evenings in Oxford that seem almost rehearsed. The air too mild, the conversation too polished, the wine poured at precisely the right temperature. The dinner at St. Cuthbert's that night was one of them. A donors' event, formally described as a celebration of academic patronage, though the tone was closer to that of a minor coronation. The chandeliers glowed softly, and the portraits of long-dead provosts looked on with the mild disapproval of men who preferred silence to gratitude. Sir Julian Rake was seated at the high table, every inch the benefactor's silver hair, blue tie, eyes that glinted with the self-knowledge of charm. I watched him over the rim of my glass. There is something about those who give money to Oxford. They do so not out of generosity, but the desire to be remembered. The college gives them immortality in return. They give it guilt. Lewis sat 2 places away, visibly uneasy among the silverware. He was whispering something to a lecturer about the lamb. I envied him for the simplicity of his discomfort. For me, the entire evening carried the faint vibration of a lie, like a piano string slightly out of tune. When the toast was made to the late Dr. Eleanor Blake, the pause that followed was imperceptibly too long. Sir Julian lifted his glass but did not drink. He murmured something to the woman beside him. Margaret Vale, the art historian from Magdalen, and she smiled, though not as one amused. It was the brittle smile of someone performing composure. Later, over the coffee service, I found myself beside her. She was tall, elegant, the kind of woman whose intelligence was both armor and invitation. She said softly that she had known Eleanor, though not well enough to call her a friend. There had been an argument, she admitted, over a photograph that should never have been published. A photograph, she added, that had the power to ruin lives. She did not elaborate, and I did not press. One learns that some truths need their own timing. Sir Julian appeared then, his manner affable but studied. He made a show of complimenting the wine, then turned to me with the faint curiosity of a man who had been warned. "You're with the police, aren't you?" he asked, though his tone carried no real question. I told him I was assisting with the inquiry into Dr. Blake's death. He nodded gravely, then lowered his voice. A tragedy, though hardly unexpected. The poor woman was unstable, you know. She'd been blackmailing me over something that never even happened. He smiled as he said it, as though seeking my complicity in the absurdity of her claim. I returned the smile, but inwardly I noted the precision of his phrasing. Something that never even happened. The word even was his defense, a linguistic hedge that revealed more than it concealed. When he excused himself to address the provost, Margaret Vale looked at me with a kind of weary amusement. "You won't find your answers here," she said. "The living are worse liars than the dead." She slipped away before I could ask more, her perfume faintly reminiscent of lilies or perhaps funerals. The dinner broke up in a flurry of polite laughter and the rustle of gowns. Outside, the rain had begun again, gentle but persistent. Lewis muttered that it was all a waste of time, a parade of people saying as little as possible. I told him that sometimes silence is the most articulate response. On the way out, I noticed the framed program for the evening's event. The printer's ink had smudged, slightly on one of the lines, turning in memoriam Dr. Eleanor Blake into in memory Dr. Eleanor Blake. A small omission, but one that lingered. Memory without, as if the college had already moved past possession into disavowal. Back in my flat, I poured the last of the whiskey and sat by the window, listening to the rain's slow percussion. I thought of Margaret Vale's phrase, the photograph that could ruin lives, and of Sir Julian's perfectly rehearsed denial. Somewhere between the two lay the truth, blurred, perhaps, like an overexposed image. Before turning out the light, I glanced at my crossword. The clue read, "Hidden image, 4 letters." I wrote a mask, then paused, uncertain whether I'd solved it or confessed to it. It was Lewis who first mentioned the photograph laboratory, more as an afterthought than a revelation. He said it over lunch in that distracted way of his, the kind that often conceals a small truth in a heap of irrelevance. Dr. Blake's students, he recalled, had been using the old darkroom in the Fine Arts building, a relic from the days when photography still required patience and darkness. She had gone there a few days before she died, asking questions about developing old negatives. The darkroom smelled of vinegar and silver and something faintly sorrowful, the way old chemicals seem to retain the ghosts of what they once revealed. A young technician let us in. His name, I think, was Harris, a nervous boy with ink-stained fingers who regarded authority as something slightly contagious. He told us that Dr. Blake had brought in a set of negatives, old ones, black and white, showing a rowing team by the river. I asked if he had seen the prints. "Only one," he said. "She had taken the others away before they dried. Then, after she died, the missing negative went missing again." I asked him how he knew it was gone. He hesitated, as though afraid of some minor betrayal. "Because someone came for it, sir. A man. Said he was collecting on behalf of the college. He had a key to the storage drawer. I asked when that had been." Tuesday morning, the day after Eleanor's death. Lewis looked at me across the dim red light. It wasn't a surprise I saw in his face, but resignation, the sort of look one gets when realizing the world is exactly as corrupt as one feared. I asked if the man had signed the register. Harris shook his head. Said he didn't think to ask. I thanked him and left him to his guilt. Back outside, the rain had begun again, soft and steady. We walked toward the river, neither of us speaking. In Oxford, the rain does not fall so much as insinuate itself a fine mist that seeps through stone and thought alike. I kept seeing the image Harris had described of the blurred figure by the water, the rowers poised mid-motion, a sliver of another face reflected faintly on the surface. A woman's face, perhaps, or merely the accident of light. Later, in my office, I unrolled the remaining prints. 6 of them. In each, the same composition of 7 men, all youth and pride, their futures unspent. Sir Julian among them, his grin too bright for the weather. But there was something strange about the sequence. The reflection in the river was not constant. In 2 of the prints, there was an 8th form visible only as a shadow, not on the bank in the water. I thought at first it was a trick of exposure. Then I saw a ripple where none should be, a blurred distortion that seemed to move closer from frame to frame. I lit a cigarette and stared at the photographs beneath the lamplight. The faintest smudge appeared in the margin of one negative, as though a finger had touched it before it dried. Whoever took it away would have known its significance. It was not the image that mattered, but the process of the proof that it had once existed. Lewis arrived later with a cup of coffee and an expression that suggested news. He had checked the college records. The equipment key for the darkroom was kept by the dean's office. The signature in the ledger was old-fashioned, careful of the sort of handwriting that belonged to someone educated when ink still mattered. I told him to lock the photographs in evidence. He asked what I thought they showed. I said only that they showed something that was never meant to be seen. That night, as I sat alone, the sound of rain against the window seemed to echo the faint hiss of the developing tray. I remembered the technician's words that she had taken only 1 print with her. It struck me that perhaps she had not taken it for herself at all, but for someone else, someone who knew how to look beyond the visible image. A clue in the negative, I thought. Not what is printed, but what refuses to appear. Like the truth itself, hidden, reversed, and only legible in the light of its absence. It is a curious thing how people confess not by revealing, but by rearranging the truth until what remains looks safely like honesty. Margaret Vale's confession arrived that way, half in words, half in absences. She had telephoned late, her voice composed, asking if I might stop by her rooms at Magdalen the following afternoon. There was a tone in her voice I recognized from too many similar calls, a tone not of guilt, but exhaustion. Her rooms overlooked the cloisters, where the afternoon light fell like dust through the arches. She offered tea, which I declined, and cigarettes, which I accepted. The conversation began with hesitation, though it was clear she had rehearsed it. She said she wished to correct a misapprehension that Eleanor's death had nothing to do with her. She paused before adding, almost too quietly, that perhaps it had everything to do with her husband. Peter Vale. The name had not surfaced for years, and yet it hovered around the case like an echo I could not place. A young historian drowned in the river in 1975. A tragedy of youth and drink, or so the record said. I asked how much she remembered that night. She smiled faintly, a smile that contained both amusement and self-defense, and said she remembered only the sound of rain and the way the clock in St. Cuthbert's Tower refused to chime. It was then she mentioned the photograph. Eleanor, she said, had found it among Peter's papers. It showed the rowing team of that same year, Julian, Ashcroft, Peter, and others. A group of men bound by wine and vanity. But there was another figure in the original, half hidden, blurred by motion. A woman. Eleanor. The photograph was a record of something never meant to be recorded. I asked why Eleanor would have wanted to revive it. Margaret said she wanted to tell the truth. To absolve herself, perhaps, of complicity? But absolution requires another's consent, and Julian's, it seemed, was not forthcoming. When the grant was withdrawn, it was punishment, not administration. Eleanor's paper on memory and image, how photographs distort recollection, had cut too close to certain living memories. I asked if she believed Julian had killed her. She shook her head. Not Julian, she said, not in any deliberate way. But he had killed her hope. The rest she did herself. She looked at me then, and I saw that behind the composure there was an intelligence at war with itself. She said she had destroyed the last print of the photograph after Eleanor's death. Couldn't bear to keep it. But even as she said it, her eyes shifted toward the drawer beside her. I waited. She did not move. On my way out, she asked if I had ever believed in confession. I told her that belief was not required, only accuracy. She smiled again, the kind of smile people give when they have lied to themselves long enough to call it truth. Outside, the bells of Magdalen were striking 5. The air smelled of wet leaves and old stone. I walked without direction, my mind circling her words. The confession had been carefully constructed, not a lie, but an arrangement that kept guilt symmetrical, elegant. She had reversed the story, perhaps without even knowing it. It was not Eleanor who had betrayed her, but she who had betrayed Eleanor not through malice, but through fear. Back in my office, I spread the photographs once more. There, in the reflection on the water, the faint outline of a woman's face appeared again. Not Eleanor's. I was sure now. The shape of the hat, the angle of the jaw, Margaret Vale. She had been there that night on the river bank, when Peter fell or was pushed or slipped into the dark. I lit another cigarette and let the smoke curl upward like a thought refusing to finish. The sound of the river outside the window filled the silence. Lewis came in with the latest report of the usual bureaucratic clutter, and I asked him, almost idly, whether he believed people could tell the truth backward. He looked puzzled, then said he supposed so if they were clever enough. Perhaps that is what confession really is, a story told in reverse, until innocence appears where guilt once stood. And perhaps that is why so many of us keep talking long after the truth has already been said. There are moments when investigation ceases to feel like pursuit and becomes instead a mirror held too close to the face. That was how it seemed then, every question answered by another reflection. The case had become a series of double murders, 2 women, 2 photographs, two deaths separated by decades but joined by the same river. Lewis had gone to the records office that morning. I met him outside the college gates, the frost still clinging to the grass. He looked tired, or perhaps simply disillusioned. He said the archives confirmed that Peter Vale's death had been ruled accidental. But there was no coroner's photograph, no witness statement signed by either Julian Rake or Ashcroft, though both were said to have been present that night. Their names appeared only once on the rowing team list from that year, beside Eleanor's. The triangle of names had always been there. We had only been too polite to see it. We walked through the quadrangle, the sound of our steps echoing faintly against the chapel wall. Somewhere above, a student played a piece of Bach, uneven, hesitant, the rhythm collapsing and reforming like a memory being rehearsed. I stopped to listen, and Lewis said it sounded as though the player was practicing both hands separately. A game of doubles, he called it, without knowing how right he was. Inside, I went again to Eleanor's office. The bookshelves stood in the same meticulous order, but I noticed a gap now, a missing volume between Blake's collected works of Wordsworth and a copy of Memory and Forgetting. A space large enough for a single file or thin notebook. I crouched to read the dust marks. The absence was new, recent. Someone had returned after we had sealed the room. Lewis asked what I was looking for. I told him nothing that could be found easily, but as I stood again, my eye caught the reflection of the desk lamp on the glass cabinet. Two reflections, not one the kind produced when the inner pane of glass had shifted. I removed the panel carefully. Behind it, folded and yellowing, was a letter. Not addressed, not signed. A draft, perhaps, or the ghost of one. It read simply, "Truth cannot be divided between two faces of the same person. One must be erased." The line struck me as too deliberate to be a metaphor. A confession, perhaps, or a thesis note. Lewis thought it meaningless, but the phrasing reminded me of something Ashcroft had said at dinner, that Eleanor had been fascinated by duplicity and art mirror images, altered negatives, the distortion of truth through reflection. Outside, the afternoon light had the fragile translucence of winter glass. I told Lewis to fetch the original negatives from evidence. We developed them again in the station darkroom, the smell of the fixer as acrid as memory itself. When the first print appeared, I felt that cold tightening in the stomach that precedes understanding. There were indeed two versions of the same photograph, one printed from the reversed negative. In one, the blurred woman faced left, in the other, she faced right. Her profile, reversed, was no longer Eleanor's. It was Margaret Vale's. I did not tell Lewis immediately. There are discoveries best left to ripen into dread. Instead, I asked him to check the date stamp on the envelope. March 1975, 3 days before Peter Vale's drowning. The handwriting on the label was neat, exact, the same old-fashioned curl I'd seen in Ashcroft's notes. When we finished, I lingered in the dark room alone. The dim red light turned every image into something elegiac. I thought of Margaret's voice, calm, deliberate, confessing and withdrawing in the same breath. I thought of Eleanor's fascination with the idea of truth seen through reversal, that one side must vanish for the other to exist. Later that night I returned to my flat. The crossword lay open where I had left it. The clue read, 2 truths, 1 false 7. I wrote the answer slowly, as if testing it against the day's discoveries. Mirrors. The whiskey tasted of regret and ash. In Oxford, the past does not die. It simply changes direction and walks back toward you wearing another face. It was sometime past midnight when I realized the silence of the case had changed its tone. There is a point in every investigation when the evidence ceases to speak and begins instead to listen, as though waiting for one to misstep, to say the wrong name or believe the wrong fact. I had reached that point. Eleanor Blake's death had seemed, on the surface, to belong to the familiar catalogue of Oxford tragedies. Wine, despair, intellect turned inward until it devoured itself. But the symmetry was too precise, the arrangement too tidy. Death in Oxford, like beauty, is rarely so well composed. Lewis had gone home hours earlier, leaving me alone with the files. The photographs lay on the desk like a set of inverted prayers. I noticed, almost absently, that the ink on one of the evidence labels had bled a small, almost imperceptible smear, as though touched by a damp finger. Someone had handled it recently. I turned the label over. On the back was an initial in pencil, faint but distinct A. Ashcroft. At that moment, the pattern of omissions began to align the unsigned visitor's book, the sealed file, the missing negative. Not lies, but careful silences arranged to resemble coincidence. I telephoned the lodge. Haynes answered, his voice blurred with sleep. I asked if anyone had entered the college that night. No one, sir, save Dr. Ashcroft. He's often working late. He signed out about 10 minutes ago. The rain had begun again by the time I reached St. Cuthbert's. The courtyard was deserted, the stones slick as glass. Ashcroft's light still burned in the upper window. I found him seated at his desk, a book open. Before him, his hands folded as though in prayer. He greeted me without surprise. He said he supposed I had come about Eleanor. I told him I had. He sighed then, the sigh of a man rehearsing remorse. She was unstable, he said again. She wanted to destroy reputations, mine among them. I told him I did not doubt that. But what puzzled me was why, in her final hour, she should type a letter that spoke of forgiveness rather than accusation. He looked up sharply. Forgiveness, he repeated, as though the word were foreign. I reminded him that she had written, "I never forgave you for what happened that night." A curious construction, I said, for a suicide note written to the living in the past tense. He tried to dismiss it as the confusion of a disturbed mind, but as he spoke, his fingers betrayed him, drumming lightly against the table. A slow, regular rhythm with 4 beats and a pause. I recognized it. The same pattern as the pendulum in his office clock, the clock that ran half a second slow. I realized then what the hesitation in his speech had meant. He was keeping time with guilt. I told him about the photograph, the missing negative, the altered reflection. He said nothing. The rain against the windows thickened, a soft percussion. When at last he spoke, his voice was steady, almost academic. "You cannot imagine what Oxford was like in the 70s, he said. "The brilliance, the arrogance. We thought we were gods. Peter Vale was drunk that night. Julian dared him to row across the river in the dark. I tried to stop them, but it was too late." "And Eleanor?" I asked. "She saw," he said simply. "She saw, and she never forgot." He stood then, walked to the window. I told him that Eleanor had not poured her own wine, that the glass bore only his prints. He turned pale but composed. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said. "She was threatening to tell Julian. I wanted to frighten her, only to remind her how fragile reputation can be. But she drank more than I expected." The confession was not shouted or wept. It arrived quietly, like rain subsiding. I left him there, the weight of his past pressing the air, thin. By dawn, he had hanged himself in the chapel. The note on his desk contained a single sentence: "Forgive me, Eleanor." Lewis found me later that morning, staring at the empty quadrangle. He said we had the truth at last. I told him we had a truth, the one that best suited the dead. And yet, as the day broke across the spires, I could not escape the thought that Eleanor's letter had never been finished. The words we found on the typewriter, you must understand that I never might have continued differently. Perhaps it was never meant to end in accusation at all. Perhaps she had written, "I never blamed you." The wrong suicide, I thought, is not the one who dies, but the one who believes he must. There is a peculiar stillness that follows confession, not peace exactly, but the hollow quiet of a room after a clock has stopped. Ashcroft's death had brought that kind of silence to St. Cuthbert's. The students still whispered about it in the cloisters, of course, but Oxford has always been skilled at folding scandal neatly into its archives. Within a week, the porters would forget the sound of the ambulance, and the papers would move on to some brighter tragedy. I had no appetite for resolution. There was still something missing, a faint discord beneath the tidy surface of remorse and suicide notes. I had gone through Ashcroft's desk myself the morning after his death, while Lewis spoke with the college solicitor. The man had been meticulous, every paper aligned, every drawer locked, every item catalogued in its own obsessive order. But order, I have learned, is its own disguise. In the back of a drawer, beneath a stack of unused envelopes, I found an old envelope marked Photographic Plates, 1975. Inside, a single negative. The light through the window made the film tremble faintly between my fingers. I knew what it was before I held it to the desk lamp. The missing photograph, the one Eleanor had tried to resurrect. Lewis arrived as I was developing it in the small dark room the college still kept in the basement, the same room where Eleanor had worked before she died. The smell of chemicals was sharp, nostalgic, almost ecclesiastical in its precision. He stood beside me, his reflection dim in the red light, and asked what I hoped to find. I told him the truth rarely survives translation. Perhaps a ghost of it might. When the image began to appear, slow as thought, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. There they were, 7 men and a woman by the river, summer of 1975. Sir Julian smiling, Ashcroft beside him, and Peter Vale in the center, his eyes half closed as though already dreaming of the water that would soon take him. The reflection on the river showed 8 figures, not 7, and behind them, faint but distinct, stood Eleanor, not blurred, not accidental, but deliberate. Watching. Lewis leaned closer, frowning. He said it could have been a trick of the exposure. I nodded, though I knew better. The shadow had intent. I noticed then that the border of the photograph bore a faint scrawl, written perhaps by Ashcroft himself. Truth reversed becomes memory. It was not the note of a scientist, but of a man attempting absolution. I turned the print over and found a smear of what might once have been ink or tears, or the residue of time. We took the photograph back to my flat, away from the college eyes. I poured us both a drink and placed the print on the table under the lamplight. The faces seemed to shift subtly with the whiskey's reflection, the living and the dead mingling in silence. Lewis asked whether I believed Ashcroft's story, that it had been an accident. I said belief was a luxury I no longer afforded. People rarely confess to what they've done. They confess to what they can endure remembering. He said the case was finished, that we should leave the dead their peace. Perhaps he was right. But as he spoke, I noticed something small and incongruous in the lower corner of the photograph by the shadow of the boathouse, a faint figure blurred, kneeling as if retrieving something from the water. The gesture was unmistakable once seen. Eleanor again, not witnessing, but rescuing. She had not been complicit in the death. She had tried, perhaps too late, to prevent it. The knowledge changed nothing legally, but it altered everything else. I understood then why she had kept the negatives, why she had pursued the truth so relentlessly. It was not guilt that haunted her, but injustice. I told Lewis to keep the photograph filed under evidence, though I knew it would likely vanish in the system. Oxford does not preserve such truths, it absorbs them, like rain into stone. When he left, I poured another drink and sat alone before the window. The city lay beneath a thin mist, its spires softened, the bells distant and unhurried. I thought of Eleanor, of her quiet persistence, and of the strange mercy that sometimes lies hidden in error. The photograph rested on the table beside me, the faces now faint in the lamplight. I could just make out hers, the faint outline of a woman by the river, watching, waiting, refusing to disappear. It is strange, the way the river remembers. Long after the witnesses have gone and the truth has been filed into silence, it continues to move, carrying the silt of every lie, every confession, every unspoken thing. I went back there on the morning after Ashcroft's funeral, not from duty, but from something quieter and less defensible. The chair-well looked the same as it had on that first day, a slow, indifferent sheet of grey, broken only by the faint tremor of rain. I stood near the boathouse and watched the punts knocking lightly against the pier, their chains restless in the current. It was almost absurd to think that so much had happened because of a single photograph, an image of youth pretending to be permanent. Oxford has always believed in the immortality of its own beauty, though beneath the varnish there is rot enough to last centuries. Lewis had refused to come with me. He said there was nothing left to see, that we had done what needed doing. He was right in the procedural sense. But procedures, I have found, are merely ways of preventing people from asking the questions that keep them awake at night. I lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl into the damp air, watching it dissolve into something shapeless and forgiving. There is a particular sound the river makes when it slides against stone, a quiet, almost conversational murmur, as though reminding one that it has heard everything before. I tried to recall Eleanor's face then, not the still mask from her room, but the living one I had known years earlier, the one that could soften even the sharpest remark with an unexpected kindness. She had always spoken of truth as though it were a fragile thing, capable of drowning if handled too roughly. Perhaps she was right. I thought of Ashcroft's final note. Forgive me, Eleanor, and found I could not. Not entirely. His confession had been too late, his remorse too tidy. Death, I've often noticed, makes cowards appear noble. But there was another letter, unfinished, that troubled me. Still the one on Eleanor's typewriter. You must understand that I never— The sentence had ended there. I had once assumed the next words would condemn, but now I was less certain. Perhaps she had meant to absolve. Perhaps forgiveness, in the end, was meant for herself. A heron lifted from the reeds, its wings laboring against the air. The sound broke the quiet, and I felt the faintest sting of rain on my face. The river was rising slightly, pushing against the banks. I knelt and touched the water, cold and patient, and thought of Peter Vale's reflection captured all those years ago, a man caught forever between motion and memory. There is a cruelty in preserving photographs, like secrets, never age. When I stood again, I noticed something in the mud near the pier, a fragment of glass, the size of a coin, faintly curved. A lens, perhaps, from a camera long discarded. I picked it up and threw it. The world sharpened unnaturally, the water darker, the trees skeletal, my own reflection distorted. It was a useless object, and yet I pocketed it. We are all collectors of small evidence that will never stand up in court. By the time I reached the bridge, the clouds had begun to thin. The bells of Magdalen were tolling for morning service with a sound that always seems to carry both promise and apology. I paused halfway across and looked down at the water again. The surface held its usual duplicity, tranquil above, treacherous below. A student rowed past, his oar cutting a perfect scar into the calm. The mark healed itself instantly, as though the river had forgiven him. I stayed until the last chime faded into mist, then turned back toward the city. The stones were slick underfoot, the air heavy with the scent of rain and wood smoke. Somewhere behind me, the heron cried once, low and distant, before the sound disappeared into the same stillness that had begun it all. Oxford does not change. It waits. And the river, eternal as regret, keeps its confidences better than any of us ever will.